I didn't grow up calling it Pungo. That name came later, after maps, after roads, after people decided the land needed to be explained. When I was young, it was just the marsh. Low country, flat and wet, where the ground never fully dried and the air always carried the smell of rot disguised as salt. My father said the land there remembered water the way bone remembers breaks. Even in summer, fog pooled low and stubborn, clinging to the reeds and cypress knees like it had nowhere else to go. The mosquitoes were relentless, but that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the silence underneath them, the way the marsh swallowed sound once you went far enough in. This wasn't wilderness in the romantic sense. It was worked land, cleared, drained, fenced, and resented. Settlers had been trying to tame it since before Virginia decided what it was called. They failed more often than the records admit. I was there because my father had died, not violently, not mysteriously, just suddenly enough to leave everything unfinished. The house sat near the edge of the marsh, an old timber pilings darkened by decades of damp. It had been in our family since before the Revolution, passed down through men who wrote their names in ledgers and kept their fears out of ink. The deeds went back far, the stories went farther. I came to sort what was left. The first thing I noticed wasn't the house, it was the ground. The marsh had pulled closer, not flooded, not overtly. But the dry boundary I remembered from childhood had softened, crept inward. The reeds leaned nearer the fence. The mud reached places it shouldn't have, swallowing old footpaths like it had been waiting for permission. I told myself it was neglect, years without maintenance, drainage failing. That explanation lasted until nightfall. As the sun dropped, the air thickened, not darker, heavier. Sound traveled oddly, stretched thin and distorted. Frogs called, but not in rhythm. One would begin, then stop, abruptly, as if interrupted. Then another, closer, would answer, not with the same call, but with something similar, close enough to feel wrong. I stood on the porch, listening. That's when I heard her. At first, it wasn't a voice, it was motion. The sound of something moving through shallow water, slow, deliberate, careful not to splash, not random, purposeful, like someone who knows exactly where the ground will hold. I leaned forward, peering into the fog. Hello, I called, more out of habit than expectation. The sound stopped, not faded, stopped. The fog shifted then, not dispersing, but reorganizing. It drew inward, thickening over one stretch of marsh where the water reflected nothing. No stars, no moon, just dark. I felt watched, not seen, considered. I went inside and shut the door. That night, sleep came in fragments. The house settled and creaked like old wood always does. But underneath it, there was something else. A faint, dragging sound, repeating patient, always circling the same distance from the house. When morning came, I walked the property line. Footprints lined the edge of the marsh, bare, human-shaped, too deep for the weight they suggested. And they all pointed toward the water except one. That one pointed back toward the house. I did not yet know the stories. I did not yet know the word witch had ever been attached to this land. But standing there, staring at the place where water met soil and refused to let go, I understood something older and simpler. Whatever lived in that marsh had noticed my return, and it was adjusting. By the second day, the marsh had changed its tone. That's the only way I can describe it. Not its shape, not its reach, its mood. The air felt attentive now, as if the land had shifted from background to audience. Every sound carried farther than it should have, then died abruptly, swallowed mid-echo. I spent the morning inside, sorting through my father's things, papers, tools, ledgers wrapped by humidity. He had been meticulous in most matters, but there were gaps, entire years undocumented, drawers left intentionally empty, the kind of omissions that don't happen by accident. Near noon, I found the journal. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It sat on a shelf behind an old atlas. Its leather quivered, darkened, and cracked. No title, no name, just dates. Written in a tight, slanted hand I recognized immediately. The entires weren't daily. Weeks passed between some pages, months between others, but the tone never varied. Factual, restrained, almost careful not to provoke something by saying too much. Waterline closer today, fence posts leaning again, animals restless at night. No speculation, no fear written openly, just observation. Then, midway through the book, the entries shifted. Heard movement near the marsh after dark, some distance as before. Still won't cross the shallow stretch. I felt a tightening in my chest reading that. The phrasing wasn't casual. It suggested repetition, pattern. Outside, the fog rolled in earlier than the night before. Despite the sun still hanging high, it gathered in pockets, rising and falling like breath. The marsh reflected it dully, surface unbroken, water thick as oil. I stepped onto the porch. The smell hit me first, brine and decay, layered with something sharper underneath. Not rot, something used. Light clothes soaked too long and dried without washing. Then came the sound. This time it wasn't movement, it was humming, low, tuneless. Not a song, an approximation of one, a sustained sound that wavered slightly as if the throat producing it wasn't accustomed to holding pitch. It came from the same stretch of marsh as before. I didn't call out. I didn't move. The humming paused. A moment passed, then it resumed, closer to my face, as if it had adjusted after listening. My skin prickled, not fear yet, recognition. The sense that something had gathered new information and was applying it immediately. I remembered something my father once said, years ago, when I asked why he never finished the marsh despite leaving beside it. Some waters don't want company, he replied, and some remember when they are refused. The journal slipped from my hand and hit the porch boards with a dull thud. The humming stopped. I waited. Nothing. Too much nothing. I forced myself to move, stepping down the porch stairs, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. Each step felt measured, like the earth was testing my weight, my intent. The fog brushed my knees, cool and damp, clinging longer than mist should. Halfway to the fence line, I saw it. A length of cloth caught on a reed near the water's edge. Gray, weathered, old, not tarred, placed. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The smell was stronger here, and beneath it, something else. Iron, faint but unmistakable. The cloth stood, though there was no wind, shifting just enough to reveal the impression beneath it. A footprint, bare, deep, facing inland. The human being began again, directly behind me. Not loud, not threatening, patient, as if whoever, whatever stood there already knew I would turn around eventually, and was content to wait until I understood why I shouldn't. The humming did not follow me into the house. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. The silence that replaced it had weight, pressing in through the walls as if the house itself were listening for what had just passed. I barred the door out of habit, even though the latch had never held against anything more determined than wind. The wood beneath my palm felt damp, swollen with years of moisture it had never fully shed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke. I lit a lamp and kept it close, not because the room was dark, but because the light felt like proof that I still occupied the space intentionally. I returned to my father's journal. Further in, the handwriting tightened, strokes heavier, as if the act of writing had become labor. It copies, not well, but it tries. No subject, no explanation, just a statement written twice on the same page. I turned another page. Don't answer it. That line was underlined hard enough to tear the paper. The house creaked as something shifted beneath it. The tide. I told myself, the marsh rising and falling like it always had, but that sound didn't have the randomness of water. It repeated, faint and layered, circling the perimeter of the house. I moved to the back window. The fog had thickened, pulling in a way that erased depth. Fence posts vanished halfway down their length. The marsh beyond looked flattened, two-dimensional, like a backdrop waiting to be disturbed. Then I saw the marks. They weren't fresh footprints. They were impressions left after something had stood still for too long. Shallow ovals pressed into the mud, closer to the house than before, arranged in a loose arc that mirrored the porch. Waiting marks. The humming returned, muffled now, filtered through wood and glass. It carried a wetness to it, like sound produced with a mouth not fully closed. The pitch wavered, adjusted, and then, unmistakably, shaped itself into something closer to breathe. Not speech, practice. I remembered stories I'd half heard as a child, whispered by neighbors who never stayed long when visiting. They never spoke directly of the marsh. They spoke around it, of livestock that refused water, of fences that rotted faster on the side of the property, of voices carried by fog that sounded like people you knew but never quite right. I had dismissed them then. Now, standing there, listening to something attempt to arrange itself into familiarity, I understood why those stories had survived without detail. Precision would have invited attention. The lamp flickered, not out, just enough to notice. The humming stopped. The quiet that followed felt deliberate, expectant. I stepped back from the window. Outside, something shifted in the fog. Not moving closer, not retreating, just adjusting position. The impression was subtle but unmistakable, like someone stepping to one side to see better through glass. I realized then what the cloth at the marsh edge had been, not a warning, an offering. And whatever had left it had been patient enough to wait for me to recognize that fact on my own. Because the marsh was no longer watching the house. It was watching me. The house did not protect me the way I had expected it to. That belief, that walls separate, that doors define safety, belonged to places where the land hadn't already decided who it listens to. Here, the house felt less like a barrier, more like a vessel, something hollowed out and left standing because it served a purpose. The sound came again, closer now, but distorted, not humming, speech, or something arranged to resemble it. It drifted through the floorboards first, a faint vibration rather than noise, like words spoken too low to hear but heavy enough to be felt. The lamp glass rattled gently in response. I froze, listening with my whole body instead of my ears. Come. The word was incomplete. The shape of it collapsed before finishing, swallowed by a wet catch in the throat that made my skin crawl. It wasn't calling me. It was testing whether that sound would reach me. I backed away slowly, hard hammering, until my shoulders met the wall. The wood was cold and damp through my shirt. I could feel the house settling again, timbers shifting, responding to pressure that wasn't wind. The journal slipped in my grip. I bent to retrieve it, and that's when I noticed the marks inside the house. Mud. Small smears along the edge of the door frame, half dried, as if something had brushed against the wall, against the wood, without fully entering. They weren't handprints. They weren't footprints. They were too narrow, too elongated, streaked rather than pressed, dragged. I remembered the cloth again, how it hadn't been torn or discarded, how it had been placed where I would see it, placed with intent. The sound came from beneath the floor now, low and resonant, moving from one side of the house to the other, slow enough to track. I imagined something crouched below, head tilted, listening to how the structure responded to its presence. The house answered. Boards creaked in reply, echoing the movement, translating weight into sound. The rhythm of it made my stomach turn. Call and response, test and adaptation. I pressed my hand over my mouth to quiet my breathing. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, clinging to the glass in soft, formless shapes. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I was a face emerged from it. Not clearly, just the suggestion of structure where there shouldn't have been any. The sound shifted again. It tried my voice, not my words, my cadence. The rise and fall of breath I hadn't realized it could hear. A low murmur that matched the rhythm of my own breathing, just out of sync enough to feel wrong. That was when panic finally took hold. Not screaming panic, controlled, suffocating fear that tightens every muscle and drains warmth from the hands. I realized then that whatever lived in the marsh wasn't bound by distance. It was bound by attention. I had given it that. The sound withdrew suddenly, retreating outward, fading into the marsh like it had never been there at all. The house settled back into stillness, leaving only the ticking of the lamp and the distant call of insects trying and failing to return to rhythm. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back to the wall, journal open in my lap, waiting for the moment when the marsh decided it had learned enough, and knowing, with a certainty that felt heavier than fear, that when it returned, it would not sound the same. Morning didn't clear the fog. It thinned it just enough to make the marsh visible again, which was worse. The water lay flayed and dull, reflecting nothing but conviction. Even the sky appeared uncertain above it, pale and washed out, as if light itself hesitated to commit. The reeds stood motionless, their tips darkened and bent, heavy with moisture that never seemed to evaporate. I stepped outside with the journal tucked under my arm. The ground near the house had softened overnight. My boots sank slightly with each step, leaving impressions deeper than they should have been. When I reached the edge of the marsh, I stopped. The footprints were still there, not fresh, maintained. The same hollow depressions smoothed under the edges as if water had passed over them gently, preserving their shape instead of erasing it. They traced a loose path along the boundary, never crossing into open water, never stepping fully onto dry ground. A line of hesitation. I followed them with my eyes until they vanished into fog. Something about that restraint unsettled me more than pursuit would have. Predators cross boundaries, animals wander. This thing understood limits, not because it feared them, but because it respected their function. I remembered another line from the journal. It won't cross where the water moves. At the time, I hadn't understood it. Standing there now, listening to the marsh breathe, it made a terrible kind of sense. The stagnant water, the pooled, unmoving stretches, felt heavy, expectant. But where narrow channels cut through, where the water flowed just enough to carry debris and sound, there was an absence. Not safety, refusal. I moved toward one of those channels, a shallow cut where runoff fed into the marsh proper. The ground firmed slightly beneath my boots. The smell changed, less sour, less old. Behind me, the fog shifted. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The sensation was unmistakable. Pressure at my back, awareness without touch. Something had followed as far as it was willing. I took another step toward the moving water. The pressure stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, testing the boundary without looking. My body understood before my mind did. The thing in the marsh did not follow cross motion. It lingered instead, waiting at the edge of what it could not use. A sound rose behind me, not the humming, not the voice, a wet rustling, frustrated, impatient. The reeds shook slightly through the air, was still. I felt the attention sharpen, narrow, like a gaze focusing. I turned then. The fog parted just enough to reveal a shape at the boundary. Not a full figure, never that simple. A suggestion of height. Shoulders where there shouldn't have been any. Hair or something that moved like it, hanging in dark, tangled lengths. The lower half dissolved into the fog and water, confusing definition. It did not step forward. It watched, and in that stillness, I understood something vital. The restraint was temporary, not inability, preparation. The marsh did not rush. It waited until the conditions were right. I backed away slowly, keeping my feet near the moving water until I reached firmer ground. The pressure eased, though it didn't disappear. It simply shifted, retreating back into the marsh with a patience that felt practiced. Inside the house, I found something new. The back door stood ajar, not forced, not damaged, just open enough to suggest it had been tested. On the floor beneath it lay another strip of cloth, darker than the first, damp with marsh water, marked faintly with mud that looked almost like fingers. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The marsh was no longer offering. It was negotiating. I shut the back door without looking down. The hinge complained softly, warped from damp, and for a moment I thought the sound might answer itself, that the house would echo something back that didn't belong to it, but nothing followed. The silence that settled afterward felt deliberate, as if the marsh were allowing me that much. I placed the journal on the kitchen table and forced myself to read further. The later entries were sparse, shorter, written farther apart on the page, as if the act of recording had begun to feel dangerous. It listens when written about. It prefers hearing to seeing. One page had been torn out, another had been crossed through so heavily the paper had nearly split. Whatever had been written there, my father had decided it was better erased than remembered. I tried to imagine him here alone, listening to the same sounds, weighing the same decisions. The thought unsettled me more than the presence outside. He had known this land longer than I did. If he had still feared it, then knowledge offered no protection. A soft scrape came from the side of the house, not beneath it, not behind it, along it. I moved slowly toward the window, keeping my steps light. The sound repeated, careful and controlled. Whatever made it wasn't testing the structure now, it was tracing it. The fog pressed closer to the glass again, thicker than before, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. But I could make out movement just at the edge of clarity. Something tall enough that its upper shape disturbed the fog higher than the reeds. A hand rose. At least, it resembled one. Too many joints, fingers bending at unfamiliar angles, thin and pale against the gray. It hovered inches from the glass, never touching, as if learning the boundary by proximity alone. Then it withdrew. The humming returned, quieter now, refined, less wandering, more intentional. It had a pattern I almost recognized, something that brushed against memory without settling into it. I understood then why the journal entries had thinned. Attention fed it. I moved away from the windows, lowering the lamp, letting the house fall back into the shadow. The humming continued, circling, never pressing closer, waiting for response. I sat at the table and held my breath until my chest burned. The sound adjusted. It softened, matched. I exhaled despite myself, and immediately the humming shifted again, aligning closer to the sound I had made. My pulse quickened. This wasn't mimicry anymore. It was calibration. I stood abruptly, chair legs scraping loudly against the floor. The humming stopped. Outside, something moved away from the wall, retreating into the fog with a slow, wet sound. Not defeated, satisfied. Later, when the air felt marginally lighter, I checked the ground beneath the window. There were marks there now, not footprints. Indentations in the mud, spaced unevenly, as if someone had stood too long in one place and then adjusted, testing balance, facing the house, facing the window where I had stood, breathing too loudly. I covered the marks with loose dirt, though I didn't know why. The act felt futile even as I did it. When I turned back toward the marsh, the fog had thickened again, swallowing the boundary hole. Whatever lived there no longer needed to approach. It had learned where I was. I stopped reading the journal after that, not because there was nothing left, but because the act of understanding began to feel like participation. The pages that followed were thinner, the handwriting uneven, words drifting closer to the margins as if my father had started to run out of room, or patience, or both. Instead, I searched the house. Old places first, attic corners where dust gathered in thick, untouched layers, trunks that smelled of mothballs and damp wool, a cedar chest so warped it groaned when I forced it open. Inside were things I didn't recognize as possessions, bundles wrapped in cloth, knotted carefully, each one tied with twine darkened by age. I did not untie them. I didn't need to. The smell was enough. Marsh water, iron, smoke, something bitter underneath, like crushed leaves rubbed too hard between fingers. There was a paper tucked beneath the top bundle, folded once, no envelope. My father's handwriting again, but looser this time. If you're reading this, don't say it out loud. Not here. No name followed. Just that. The house creaked softly as I stood there, the sound traveling through the beams in a way that made it feel less like settling and more like response. I imagined the structure as a throat, carrying vibration outward, translating intention into signal. Outside, the marsh answered, with no sound, with movement. The fog shifted away from the house in a slow, deliberate pull, revealing the waterline farther out than it had been before. The reeds bent inward, framing a narrow path that hadn't existed earlier. A strip of ground just firm enough to suggest passage, an invitation. I felt the pull immediately, a pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache that promised clarity if only I followed it. The idea of stepping onto that path felt inevitable in the way certain thoughts do when they aren't entirely your own. I stepped onto the porch. The air changed, cooler, denser. The smell sharpened, stripping away any remaining trace of salt and leaving only decay and something faintly sweet beneath it. The path shimmered slightly, not visually, but in the way heat distorts distance. I took one step toward it. The ground held. I took another. The humming began again, no longer wandering, no longer searching. It settled into a rhythm that matched the space between my steps, not urging, not pulling, accompanying. Halfway to the marsh, the sound shifted. It shaped itself into syllables, not words I recognized, not English, not anything I could place, but they carried structure, pauses, emphasis, cadence meant to be repeated, a name, not mine. The realization hit hard enough to stop me cold. My chest tightened, breathed, stalling as the syllables repeated, closer now, layered over themselves as if spoken by more than one throat trying to agree. The name dragged memory with it, not personal memory, older than that, something inherited. A sound passed down quietly, unspoken, allowed to fade but never truly forgotten. The kind of name that survives because it was once used often enough to matter. The fog thickened behind me, cutting off the view of the house. Ahead, the water stirred, not flowing, waking. I understood then why my father had written what he did, why he had never named it, why the journal broke down where it did. The marsh did not hunt with teeth or claws, it hunted with names, and it had just spoken one it hadn't used in a very long time. I stepped back, the humming faltered. The path softened immediately, ground losing its firmness, water seeping through cracks that hadn't been there seconds earlier. The invitation withdrew, not in anger, but in calculation. I retreated all the way to the porch before turning. The fog parted just enough for me to see her, not fully, never fully. A tall, narrow shape stood where the path had been, body angled wrong, limbs too still. Hair clung to her head and shoulders in damp robes, hanging forward to obscure whatever passed for a face. One arm hung at her side. The other was raised slightly, as if in greeting, as if in recognition. The fog closed again, swallowing her without sound. The marsh settled, but the name lingered in the air long after the sound stopped, pressed into my thoughts, repeated silently, waiting for the moment I might slip and give it voice. I went back inside and barred the door, and for the first time since arriving, I understood the truth my father had lived with. The marsh did not want my presence. It wanted my permission. I didn't sleep. I lay on the floor beside the barred door, back against the cold wood, listening to the house breathe around me. Every structure has its own sound at night, the tick of cooling boards, the soft complaint of nails adjusting under pressure. But this was different. This house was listening too. The name kept circling my thoughts, never fully forming, never allowing itself to be remembered cleanly. Every time my mind tried to pin it down, it slid away, leaving only the echo of its shape. That, I realized, was part of the trap. A name half known is easier to speak by accident. Somewhere beyond the walls, the marsh moved again, slow, careful, not approaching, repositioning. Just before dawn, the knocking started, not at the door, from beneath the floor, 3 taps, evenly spaced, too precise to be settling wood, too deliberate to be water. The sound traveled upward through the beams, pressing into my spine where it met the wall. I held my breath. The taps repeated, this time closer to the hearth, then closer to the stairs. It wasn't moving physically, it was learning the structure, mapping hollow spaces, identifying where sound carried best, where it could be heard most clearly. When the tapping stopped, the silence that followed was worse. Silence invites imagination, and imagination is exactly what the marsh feeds on. I stood and lit the lantern. The flame burned low and blue at first before steadying, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. Every shadow felt slightly delayed, as if the light reached them a fraction of a second too late. The journal lay where I'd left it, closed. I hadn't opened it since the path dissolved, but now I felt the pressure again, not pulling me outward, but inward, toward the words, toward whatever my father had tried to record before fear overtook discipline. I opened to the last intact page. The ink was smeared, as if brushed by a wet hand. It answers questions you never meant to ask. It remembers knocks. Below that, a crude diagram. The house sketched from above, lines radiating outward into the marsh like veins. Certain points were circled, one directly beneath the hearth. The tapping started again, harder now. I moved to the fireplace and knelt, pressing my ear to the stone. The sound was unmistakable, knuckles against wood, testing for response, against invitation. Don't, I whispered, not sure whether I was speaking to myself or the house. The tapping paused, then came the voice, not from beneath the floor, from behind me, low, close, intimate in the way only something very certain of its presence can be. You hear better when you kneel. My skin bent cold. I did not turn. The lantern flame bent sharply, leaning toward the sound as if drawn by breath. The shadow behind me stretched unnaturally, tall across the wall, its outline broken, shoulders slopping at angles that made my stomach twist. I didn't knock, I said, the words scraping out of my throat. I didn't call. A soft sound followed, not laughter, but something adjacent to it, a vibration that suggested amusement without warmth. You thought, the voice replied. That is enough. The floorboards creaked as weight shifted behind me, not footsteps, adjustment, like someone settling into a posture they planned to hold for a while. I forced myself to stand and turn. The room was empty, too empty. The shadows lay flat again, obedient to the lantern. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, but nothing stood where the voice had been. The tapping resumed, this time from the walls, all at once. Light, exploratory knocks from every direction. Ceiling, floor, corners, a surround of sound designed to overwhelm orientation, to make the house feel porous, temporary. I backed toward the center of the room, heart hammering, understanding dawning with brutal clarity. This was not an attack, it was a test. The marsh was probing for thresholds, sound, attention, fear, anything that could function as an opening. Knocking was ritual, a courtesy, a way of asking permission without ever using the word. I remembered the bundles in the chest, the smell, the careful knots. My father hadn't collecting them as protection. He had tied them as boundaries. I went to the attic. The ladder shook as I climbed, each rung echoing the tapping below. The attic air was stale, thick with years of sealed intent. I dragged the cedar chest into the center of the space and opened it fully for the first time. Inside, beneath the bundles, was a final object, a small wooden figure, roughly carved, featureless except for a single mark etched across where the mouth would be, a line scored deep, filled with something dark, sap, maybe, or blood. I didn't need the journal to tell me what it was. It wasn't a charm, it was a witness. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it. Below me, the house went still, not settling, not breathing, but waiting. From outside, the marsh answered with a sound I hadn't heard before, a slow, collective inhale, as if something vast had learned and leaned closer to listen. I closed the chest, not gently, and in the sudden quiet, I understood something my father never wrote down. The marsh does not force entry. It waits until you answer back. The quiet didn't last. It never does. Silence in places like Pungo isn't absence, it's compression. Sound pulled tight, waiting for a reason to snap back into being. I stayed in the attic longer than my legs wanted to hold me, sitting beside the closed cedar chest, the wooden figure heavy in my pocket like a borrowed pulse. Below me, the house had resumed breathing, carefully, as if aware that I was listening now, too. When I finally descended the ladder, the air on the lower floor felt different, warmer, damp in a way that suggested proximity rather than weather. The smell of wet leaves was stronger. The lantern flame refused to steady, bending toward the windows no matter where I stood. That's when I noticed the footprints. They had formed in the dust near the back door, shallow impressions, incomplete, as if whatever made them hadn't committed its full weight to the floor. No heel marks, just elongated ovals tapering into nothing. They stopped inches from the threshold. The door itself remained shut, latched, untouched. I knew then what the tapping had been about, not asking permission to enter the house, asking permission to be acknowledged. I backed away slowly, carefully, not to cross the invisible line. The prince is respected. My pocket felt hot now, the wooden figure pressing insistently against my thigh. I took it out and placed it on the table near the journal. The air shifted immediately. The lantern flame straightened. Outside, something moved, not forward, but sideways, circling. The sound was unmistakable now, deliberate steps through shallow water, accompanied by the wet drag of something that didn't lift its feet properly. I didn't look out the window. That felt important. Instead, I opened the journal again, flipping past the earlier entries until the handwriting changed. The lines became tighter, more urgent. The ink pressed hard enough to score the page. It will show you what it thinks you want. Do not correct it. A sound came from the porch, not knocking, breathing. Slow, patient breaths that fogged the glass without any visible source. The breath marks formed and faded in uneven patches, higher than a man's face would reach. "You brought it back," the voice said from outside, clearer now, shaped more carefully. "You kept it safe." The voice was wrong in subtle ways, cadence too even, vowels rounded incorrectly, like a mouth trained to know speech rather than born to it. It was wearing familiarity the way someone might wear borrowed clothes. "I didn't bring anything," I said. "That's not what it remembers," the voice replied. The doorknob turned, only once, not enough to open, just enough to prove it could move. I stayed where I was, hands flat on the table, eyes fixed on the wooden figure. The carved line across its mouth seemed darker now. Damn. Outside, the breathing stopped. Then came the sound of water being disturbed again, closer this time, right beneath the porch boards. Something shifted its weight, testing angles, learning where pressure traveled. "You can ask," the voice said gently. "That's all it takes. Just once." I felt the pull then, not compulsion, not panic, but curiosity sharpened into need. The desire to know what stood inches away, shaped like absence and expectation. To understand what had washed this place long before my father, before the house, before roads pretending the marsh could be crossed safely. My fingers twitched. The wooden figure vibrated faintly against the table. "No," I said. The word landed heavily, like it had weight here. The marsh reacted. The sound that followed wasn't anger, it was recalibration. Water surged outward, rippling in wide arcs as something large adjusted its position. The porch groaned as if relieved of pressure it hadn't been designed to bear. "You're doing it wrong," the voice said, thinner now, less confident. He asked. "My father paid for that," I replied. Silence. Then slowly the footsteps retreated, not leaving, just withdrawing beyond immediate reach. The breath marks faded from the glass, replaced by streaks of moisture dragged downward by unseen fingers. The footprints in the dust shifted, not forward, backward, as if whatever stood there had decided to remember the boundary after all. I waited long after the sound stopped, heart pounding, every nerve locked in readiness. When nothing else came, I moved to the window despite myself and parted the curtain just enough to see. The marsh lay flat and still, but in the water, directly beneath the porch, something had been arranged. Bundles of reeds tied with twine, fresh, laid out carefully, deliberately, a mimicry of the chest upstairs, a mirrored offering, left where it could be seen but not retrieved without crossing into wet ground. A message. "You keep yours, I keep mine." I stepped back, lowering the curtain. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It had simply decided to wait somewhere closer. The air inside the house thickened as the day waned, heavy with the damp scent of the marsh that pressed against every window. The sunlight filtered in gray and watery, never fully illuminating corners, only highlighting shadows that seemed to cling the edges of walls. I stayed near the table, the wooden figure in front of me, the journal open but untouched. The marsh outside had grown still again, but I knew better then to believe that stillness meant safety. A scraping sound began faintly along the porch walls. I froze. Not a tap, not a knock, something heavier, deliberate. Step after a slow step, dragging slightly as if reluctant to fully lift. The pattern was deliberate, studied and horribly familiar, The marsh was moving with intent. I gripped the figure and forced myself to stand. My legs protested. Each step toward the back door felt like treading through invisible resistance, like the fog itself had reached to anchor me. My hand hovered over the latch, knowing the marsh didn't require entry. It didn't need permission to watch, to learn, to measure. But something about the sound, the rhythm, compelled me to open it, even just slightly. I flinched as the latch turned. The door shifted a fraction. The air seemed to gasp, not cold, not wet, not quite wind. It was the marsh itself, exhaling, a presence leaning forward without moving, waiting to see if I would step into its domain. I didn't. The figure in my hand vibrated faintly, not a tremor of fear, not mine, something beneath it, something alive in the carved land that marked its mouth. My father had placed that figure there, but the weight it carried now was more than memory. It was a warning, a teeter, a promise. I stepped back, keeping my eyes on the door, and then the voice came again. Curiosity is a kindness, it said, soft, distant, yet intimate enough to feel like someone brushing past the back of my neck. But it has a price. The words didn't scare me as much as they unsettled me. Precise, almost clinical, like an entity explaining natural law I didn't know I had broken. My heartbeat accelerated, not from panic, but from understanding. This was a measure. Every step I had taken, every hesitation, every glance toward the marsh, it had been measured. And now the tally was being accounted for. The scraping paused. Silence fell. The fog outside thickened again, concealing the water and reeds. I heard only the slow drip of condensation along the roof, each drop like a ticking clock, counting down until the marsh decided the next movement. And then came a soft, wet sound from beneath the porch. Something shifted. Something adjusted its weight with a care that suggested patience older than the house itself. I gritted my teeth, holding the figure tight, my knuckles wide. The tapping, the dragging, the hums, the syllables, all were fragments of something larger, something I could not see but could feel in every nerve ending. The marsh had not crossed into the house, not yet, but I knew it had begun recording, measuring, waiting for the precise moment when curiosity became trespass. And I also knew that when that moment came, I would not step into it willingly. I wouldn't have the choice. The wooden figure, pressed to the table, seemed to pulse faintly as if resonating with the unseen presence outside. And in that resonance, I understood that the marsh did not forgive mistakes. It only remembered them. I sat down, every muscle locked in tense anticipation. The fog shifted outside, almost imperceptibly. Something large had repositioned itself just beyond sight, waiting. And for the first time, I realized the depth of what my father had left behind. Not a warning, not a story, not a record, but a line drawn between what belonged to the marsh and what dared to approach it. Cross it, even unknowingly, and the marsh would answer. The quiet returned, but it was heavier now, weighted with potential. Every shadow inside the house felt charged. Every sound, even the faintest creak, seemed magnified. The marsh was patient. It could wait for hours, days, longer, and I had already entered its ledger. The night arrived like a slow exhalation. It wasn't sudden, didn't announce itself. The fog rolled in over the marsh quite quietly, settling like a living blanket, thickening around the edges of the house until the world beyond the windows vanished. Inside, the air felt heavier, damp pressing against the skin, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of the marsh and something older, something rotted but persistent. I kept the wooden figure close, pressing it against my chest like a heartbeat I could carry. Every sound was amplified now. The floorboards beneath me, the wind brushing against the exterior walls, the distant drip of condensation. Even the faintest stir in the marsh made my stomach tighten. This was no ordinary place. This was a memory made physical, and it remembered me as much as I remembered it. The fog shifted. Something moved within it, large and deliberate, but it refused form. I could feel the weight of it more than see it. A pressure, a pull, as if the mist itself leaned in to test the limits of the house. My father had written that some things never cross water. That was true, but they wait, just beyond, until the right conditions present themselves, until attention falters. I heard it then, not the tapping this time, not a voice, something lower, vibrating through the boards, the walls, the very air, a hum, low and insistent. It wrapped around me, filling the room without source. It was learning, calibrating, testing not just sound but presence, the resonance of human thought pressed into a confined space. The wooden figure warmed in my hand, responding subtly, almost like it recognized the pressure from outside. I felt the faintest tremor along the carved line where its mouth should have been. A witness, yes, but also a teeter. A reminder that even silence could be measured. I moved toward the windows, careful not to break the invisible rules. The fog outside gave nothing away, yet I knew it was there, circling, circulating, waiting for a misstep. Every instinct screamed to flee. Every learned memory screamed to stay. I did neither, holding my place and letting the tension accumulate, letting the house and Marsh converse without my interference. Then the sound shifted, a wet dragging along the edge of the porch, precise, deliberate. The Marsh was testing the boundary again, not to cross, not yet, but to mark it, to imprint its presence into the house's structure. My pulse thrummed in sync with it, awareness sharp enough to make each nerve a listening post. The voice came again, shaped carefully now, using the cadence it had learned from me. You know the limits, you respect them, but you watch anyway. I swallowed, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. This wasn't punishment, it was documentation. Every pause, every glance, every hesitation was recorded in some way, some manner beyond understanding. I returned to the table, placing the figure back atop the journal. The moment it touched paper again, the vibration stopped. The sound outside became almost imperceptible, fading back into the marsh as if satisfied for now, but the fog did not recede. It lingered thick, purposeful, keeping its secrets close. It had not left, it would not leave, and in the spaces it occupied, the marsh remembered everything I had done. I realized that here, in Pungo, memory was alive, and the marsh kept it all. Dawn came slowly in gray, slipping across the marsh in hesitant streaks, reluctant to fully illuminate the world. The fog thinned slightly, but not enough to reveal the water clearly. The reeds swayed as if stirred by some unseen hand, and the air smelled damp, metallic, alive in the memory of things that had waited too long to be seen. I packed the few belongings I had brought, carefully leaving the wooden figure and journal where they had been. They weren't mine to carry. I understood now that my presence in this place had been measured, recorded, catalogued by the Marsh in ways I could never fully comprehend. My curiosity had been noted, my caution rewarded. Before leaving, I moved to the edge of the porch and looked out across the marsh. The water lay flat, gray, unyielding. The footprints, the bundles, the dragging sounds, the tapping, the syllables whispered in fog, all were gone, or hidden, or waiting for someone else to notice them. The marsh kept its secrets well, but it left enough evidence for those who were attentive to piece together fragments of its reality. I stepped onto the soft, muddy ground, careful not to disturb anything unnecessary. The air carried a subtle pull, a quiet insistence that I moved deliberately, that I honored the threshold I had crossed, if only in attention. The fog parted slightly to reveal the faint impression of the path I had almost walked, the one the marsh had allowed me to see but not tread. The house behind me was silent now, seeming smaller, somehow without anticipation, pressing through its walls, yet I knew the boundary between it and the marsh remained alive, taut, and vigilant. I left the porch and made my way to firmer ground, listening to the faint, measured whispers of water against reeds. Nothing rushed, nothing followed, not yet. As I walked toward the road that would take me away from Pungo, I carried the weight of understanding more than fear. The marsh did not need to strike. Its patience, its memory, its observation were enough. That was its power. That was its legacy. I had only brushed the edge of it, and that brush was enough to change me forever. The world beyond the fog awaited, brighter, flatter, quieter, yet in my mind, in the rhythm of my own breath, I could still feel it, the marsh learning, remembering, waiting. I glanced back once more. The house stood firm, the fog rolling around it like a protective veil. Somewhere within it, something tall and narrow shifted, adjusting slightly, satisfied that I had understood. I could not see it, could not name it, and that was the way it wanted it. The marsh does not forgive curiosity, nor does it punish recklessly. It remembers, and I left it behind. But I knew it had not left me. The memory of the Witch of Pungo would linger, etched into the marrow of my awareness, a presence waiting just beyond understanding, whispering through the reeds, humming beneath the floorboards, and teaching that some boundaries, once acknowledged, are never truly crossed. I did not speak its name. I never will.